Have you ever noticed that if you try to learn about the history of comic books, you get a lot of people saying things without any clue of how they know that? It really worries me because a lot of the people from the industry's early days are dying off now. There's a lot of stories that'll become lost forever if nobody does anything soon. So in this video, we'll be looking at how you can piece together what happened in the comic book crash of the 1990s, because anyone can do history if you know how, and we need people to do history of the comic book industry while it's still possible. First things first, how do we know that there was an industry crash in the 90s at all? If you're like me and you weren't there for it, you can't just remember that it happened. We have to look at things like how many copies particular books sold each month and go from there. Luckily for us, there are people who've figured out those numbers by studying reports from comic companies themselves, along with data from advertisers who need to know how many people are seeing their ads after all, and then published those numbers on the website comicron.com. That's COMICHRON. This makes for what historians call a primary source. It's a bunch of information close to the event you're interested in that people can look at and then say, this means X, Y, and Z. So if we look at the sales numbers published by Comicron and say that it means the comics industry crashed hard in the 90s, we've used a primary source to make a secondary source for a future historian. Secondary sources are useful when you just want to be able to say that something happened without going through the trouble of actually proving it from primary sources. Professional historians, or college students doing assignments, will usually use journal articles or books written by professionals because that's nice and respectable. Professionals also have to say what their sources are so that other professionals can argue with them, and that's why I include my sources in the descriptions of my videos, so that you can look at them yourself and tell me how I didn't understand them right. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing up secondary sources is because there already is one for the existence of a comic book crash in the 1990s. An internet denizen who goes by Colin Space Twinks, yes really, already went through the Comicron data and found that comic book sales, as represented by Amazing Spider-Man, one of the major comic books then and now, spiked significantly in 1990 and continued climbing until 1993, only to drop off sharply starting in 94 and continuing to decline ever since. When even Spider-Man can't sell, you know the industry's doing badly, so I think we can safely say that a crash happened. You can read Space Twinks' interpretation of the numbers for yourself in an essay published online that I'll have a link to in the video description. The essay also mentions an explanation for why that pattern happened. At the end of the 80s and start of the 90s, people started to notice that old comic book issues could sell for a lot of money. So naturally, people started buying new comic books in the hopes that they'd be worth a lot later on. And then everyone collectively realized that if every comic book fan in America buys the same issue, that issue would never be rare enough to be worth anything. There's a newspaper comic strip from 1995 that points out as much, see here, and we can tell that it's from 1995 by the copyright notice in the second panel. So this is a good sign that comic book fans were thinking along these lines at the time the crash was happening. A good primary source is usually talking about something that only just happened when the source was made, and it should be made by someone who has a good reason to know what they're talking about. In this case, we have a comic strip made while the thing we want to know about was happening, and we can probably assume that someone who made a newspaper comic had enough of an interest in comic books to know what fans were talking about. I call this a pretty good primary source. And let's assume that this isn't faked in some way. That does happen sometimes, and telling that the source is counterfeit is a good skill to have, but detecting fakes is mostly a matter of knowing a lot about whatever thing might be counterfeited, so I can't talk much about it. Of course, with this source, we might be looking at what people in 1995 thought had been happening. People can misremember things or exaggerate, so how do we know that there were a bunch of people buying comic books like they were investments? Flights of Fantasy was a television show that aired on local television in Maryland in the 1990s. It's mostly known nowadays because it became a video game review show whose reviews eventually became popular online under the name Gaming in the Clinton Years. Some, but not all, of the show's episodes have been archived on YouTube, and I'll link to that channel in the video's description. Fortunately, the show's first episode is one of the archived episodes, and it focuses entirely on comic books. I won't display footage of it since the video quality is bad, but you can watch it yourself and follow along with my points. This episode takes the form of an interview between the show's host and the owner of a local comic book store, so we can already be sure that this source is people who know what they're talking about. But when did this interview happen? Well, if the primary source doesn't say when it was made, which this one doesn't, it might mention things that you do know the date of. In this case, the interview mentions that the 30th anniversary of Spider-Man's debut happened the previous year, and that the first issue of the Nightfall storyline of Batman will be released the same month as the interview, which they say is June. Spider-Man debuted in 1962, so the 30th anniversary would be 1992. The year after is, of course, 1993, which is also when Nightfall began, so we can be pretty sure that this interview was filmed in June of 1993. That's right at the peak of comic sales before the crash, so we've got ourselves a solid primary source here. The interview's even about current trends in the comics industry and among buyers. We've got just about the perfect source here. And wouldn't you know it, but Space Twinks was right on the money. The interview focuses on buying comic books as an investment, the host even compares it to buying stocks, and how comic companies are catering to that by releasing issues with special gimmicky covers or producing stories where famous characters die to attract attention. As an aside, I have to say that it is genuinely odd to hear people unironically call Rob Liefeld a great artist. For those who don't know, Liefeld is a famously bad artist, as in pretty much every picture of bad 90s comic book art you see on the internet is something he drew, like this. I think the quality of books being put out by Liefeld and his ilk may have even been a factor in the comic bubble popping. Not only was everyone buying too many copies of an issue to make them have any future value, but the books were so bad no one would want to buy them in the future anyway. You can see a good example of Liefeld's work in a video I link to in the description, where a couple of fans look through a book that he drew and came up with a plot for. But anyway, I think we can pretty safely say that the comic book industry suffered a large crash in the 90s, and that it was caused by people trying to invest in comic books only to realize that they were making their investments worthless by trying to invest in them at all. So why does this matter? There are two reasons I think this episode in the history of comic books is important. The first is that, well, all history deserves to be preserved, even the history of silly comics about absurdly muscular men beating the snot out of each other. The second reason is that the 90s industry crash is probably directly responsible for all the comic book movies, cartoons, and so on that have dominated pop culture for the last 10 years or so. Like the Space Twinks essay said, the sales of comic books have been on the decline ever since the bubble popped in '94. That essay was published in 2016, so maybe in the last few years the numbers have been improving, but Marvel definitely wasn't doing well as a company before they started making that cinematic universe, and they've consistently had the biggest share of the comic book market for decades, going by Comicron's data. Marvel started making movies and TV shows of their characters in a big way in the 2000s, and that first Iron Man movie in 2008 is definitely why superhero stuff spent the next 10 years being everywhere. But it wasn't the first Marvel movie that decade. There were also X-Men and Spider-Man movies, which were made by Fox and Sony, not Marvel. Marvel had gone bankrupt in '96 and sold off the film rights to its most popular characters because they needed money and they needed it fast. Iron Man was the first Marvel movie actually made by Marvel themselves. He wasn't really a popular character at the time, which you can tell from the fact that pretty much any Spider-Man villain is still more recognizable to the average person than any Iron Man villain who wasn't in a movie. So Marvel's main product was selling poorly, and they decided to make a movie out of one of their less popular properties, probably just because they still had the film rights to them. It's a desperation move if I ever saw one, but it did work, and we probably have the 90s crash to thank for it. The most ambitious crossover event in history, thanks to people trying a new kind of investment 30 years ago. The history takes some strange paths.